So whenever you're, just go ahead.
So the good news is that we are here just to record your story, and we want you to be as comfortable and relaxed as possible, and just talk to me and tell me your experiences and what you've learned on this journey. I'd like to begin by thanking you for being here, and if you could please tell us who you are, your title, and give us a little overview of what you do here.
Sure. My name is Dr. Christopher von Nagy, and I'm the head of Shared History in the Department of History at the University of Nevada at Reno. I run the program, and I also teach in the history department. I teach public history courses and museum study courses. The program is intended to give experience to students in the realm of public history project production, oral history, museum exhibits, so that's what I do. I'm also an archaeologist, and so I have a different hat as well that I wear, and that's just another story indeed, but it does connect up with my involvement with Glen Alpine Springs.
Perfect. So,
So one more tip before I walk away. Just when he's done speaking, when your subject's done speaking, just give them 1 or 2 beats before you start talking, just so you don't talk over them, because it makes the editing so much easier in post.
thank you
Yeah.
for reminding me.
Other than that, if you have any tips, throw them out there, but I'm going to leave you to it for a couple minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Okay, are we still on?
we are still live.
Awesome. All
So
right.
before we jump in, I just wanted to let you know that if we come to a topic that you're not comfortable discussing and having on record, because this interview is going to be transcribed, it is going to become part of the Shared History Archive. So if there's something that you just don't want to discuss.
And I have a suggestion, and I should have brought along the release statement, and I apologize again for not printing that out. But there's a clause in our new one that gives the person who's interviewed, the interviewee, the right to ask for portions of the transcript or portions of the interview as recorded to be off the record. Right? We won't destroy that, but we will give them that opportunity to edit the final product. So when you're talking to people, you should mention that. And I think that's really important. We had lots of conversations about it. I'm also curious to see how your interviewees react to that, right? Because we'll let them have the transcripts and give them a certain amount of time and say, you know, if we don't hear back from you by X date, we'll assume that everything's okay and we'll go with the full transcript. But if you do have things that you feel like should be removed or altered, or you know, because people, if you're asking them questions about the past, you know, they'll talk about it, right? But they may reflect and say, you know what, here's some other things that you should know about that story, because, you know, it happened 25 years ago, and I'm not even sure about my own memory about it.
And it'll be interesting when we sit down with Warren LaRue, because he's a newsman.
Yes,
So
yes.
that'll be a really good litmus test for us. The other thing is that if you need a break, if you want to just pause for a second, just let me know, and we can stop the camera, you can take a break. And also, if there's some background that you feel that I need and you'd like to go off the record, let me know and I'll stop recording.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about Glen Alpine Springs for people like myself who are completely unfamiliar with this treasure.
It's actually a really great place for multiple reasons. The first reason is it's representative of a tradition of resorts in the Tahoe area that dates to the latter part of the 19th century, when people first were discovering the alpine beauty of the region, and where it was important to people at that time to take longer vacations where they were completely disconnected. In its resort phase, in the last 2.5 decades or so of the 19th century, people, largely middle class, upper middle class, with some means, would come up to Tahoe from Sacramento, from Berkeley, from San Francisco, from elsewhere. They'd take the train up to Truckee, they'd trek on over to the lake, they would get onto the lake on a steamer, they would go over to essentially where Camp Richardson is now, get off the steamer, take a stagecoach in to Glen Alpine Springs, and then they would stay there for a month, or at least a couple of weeks. Completely disconnected, right? Certainly no cell phones. And in fact, actually, the Preservation Society of Glen Alpine Springs was able to acquire a canvas tent of the kind that was used and reproduce it there for summer visitors. So that's one reason why it's important to the story. It's one of the few parts of Lake Tahoe today that actually dates back to that period of time and speaks to that element of Lake Tahoe society, economy, recreation. The other element that's really important is the later architecture that was built at the site. Fire is a ever-present problem in the Tahoe Basin, and there were at least 2 hotels, 2 buildings for the hotel at Glen Alpine Spring that burned down. You know, it's pretty easy. 19th century, you have kitchen fires, you have other fires, you have somebody knock over a kerosene lamp, whatever. The building catches fire, there's no sprinklers, and you're done. And you've got to build a new one. Through the initial decades, that was just almost an expected occurrence, that there would be an occasional fire and they would lose something and have to rebuild, and indeed that's what happened. The resort was actually acquired in 1920, if I recall correctly, by another individual, and we can go through their names very later on. But he was interested in not only continuing this business, the resort business, but he was actually kind of tired of the issue of fires. He didn't want to have to deal with it. He hired Bernard Maybeck. Bernard Maybeck is one of the top 10 American architects. He is well known for his work in San Francisco, in the hilly East Bay region of the Bay Area, houses in Berkeley and houses in Oakland. He was very well known for the faculty building that no longer exists at UC Berkeley, but that was built and served for many years with various functions, including a women's gymnasium. He actually was hired by the University of California at one point to find the right architects to design the master plan for the campus, a job that took him to Europe with his wife, and he toured all over the place, interviewed architects, and they developed a master plan eventually, some of which was built, some of which wasn't built. Bernard Maybeck's work is largely in the Bay Area. Berkeley suffered a fire, one of those catastrophic fires that happen from time to time, right in that Berkeley-Oakland intersection in the hills. I'm sure many people remember the more recent Oakland Hills fire, the devastating fire that destroyed hundreds and hundreds of homes and devastated Berkeley faculty's research collections, for instance. It was a tremendous fire. Bernard Maybeck went through such a fire earlier on, and the Berkeley Hills lost his house. Some of the houses that he designed for faculty members and for others in the Berkeley Hills were destroyed. And he resolved to figure out how to build something that would be fireproof. And his house that he built in response to that, he was kind of out of cash because he lost everything. It kind of damaged his business. So he used sacks, burlap sacks, dipped them into concrete, a special kind of concrete. It's actually a foamy concrete. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Those cured, right, and he hung them up as shingles on the outside of the house. And the house is still there. It's the shingle house with these concrete burlap bag shingles, and yes, it is fairly fireproof. So he was interested in fireproof architecture, which is actually a really, really important aspect of architecture and urban design in the West. Last summer, the Camp Fire destroyed an entire town, right? In part because of the vegetation in the town, but also in part because the homes that we build in these ex-urban areas that we're expanding into are extraordinarily flammable. In fact, there's a book, and I did that, you can cut that out when I touch my nose. In fact, there's a book written about fire and architecture and planning, and forgive me, I don't recall the title at the moment, but there's a picture in the book that shows one of those Duralocks you would buy at the supermarket if you want to have a quick fire in your fireplace, and compares the chemical contents of a Duralock to the average American home on the West Coast. They're pretty much the same. You've got the plastics, you've got the woods, right? Highly flammable. Maybeck was aware of different techniques that one can use, and in fact, fireproof architecture goes even earlier in American history, back to things like the Chicago fire, where some of the first really fireproof architecture was developed following that great fire, and as Chicago was beginning the process of building more and more high-rises, you don't want those to burn. That's terrible for the people in them. It's also terrible for the insurance companies and the owners of the buildings. Maybeck designed a complex for Glen Alpine Springs that reflects both his belief that architecture should be grounded in the place that it's built, and you see that in his East Bay buildings, At Glen Alpine Springs, the complex of buildings is largely wood. Yes, some of it's wood, and granite. And the granite buildings were intended to be the fireproof buildings. There's a standing dining hall that's a granite-based building. It has industrial sash windows, a fireproof roof. Adjacent to it is an octagonal kitchen, also granite, very, very fireproof. On the opposite side, there was a plan for another dining hall that was never realized, and there are other buildings that were built around the complex that were intended to be fireproof, but also form a master plan for this resort. This is Barnard Maybeck's only wilderness or rustic project in which we have multiple buildings. So it's actually very important to American architectural history because of that. The buildings are still there. He designed a series of cabins. Not all of those survive. Some of them survive. The ones that survive are actually composed of parts of the other ones that didn't survive. But there's some surviving cabins there. And there's one very, very interesting structure that if you looked at it today, you would go, well, that's like an interesting little storage building. I could keep my lawnmower in that if I had it in my yard. It's actually the Bubblestone cabin. And it was designed for people to actually camp in, replacing the canvas tents. Bubblestone is a compound, it's basically an aerated concrete that was developed by some concrete industrialists in the San Francisco area. I can't recall exactly where they had their business. But they developed a formula for making aerated concrete. They're not the only people who've done aerated concrete. Aerated concrete has several really cool engineering features. One, it's super light. Two, it's concrete. It's durable. And over time, it becomes more durable. In fact, I'm sure many people know that the Romans built in concrete, and one of the toughest concrete structures in existence today on the planet is right in Rome, with a beautiful, 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 beautiful domed roof and an oculus, the hole to let the light in the top, the Pantheon. Really durable concrete. It's been out there for couple thousand years now, not several thousand years, 2,000 years-ish. And every year that concrete is exposed to CO2, it continues to harden. So Bubblestone is great because it continues to harden too. It's lightweight, it's fireproof, it hardens. They built one. Nobody really liked it, but it was a great idea. So you can go actually see it there at Glen Alpine Springs as well. So the site has a phenomenal history. And when you go there, you actually go to the parking lot behind Fallen Leaf Lake where people go to hike up into the wilderness. You park there, you go past the Forest Service gate, there are a few cabins on the way up, and you sort of hike along a road past people's grandfathered cabins. And at the very end of that road, you reach Glen Alpine Springs, and you can't miss it because, first of all, you go by some signs, and second of all, you go by a structure that was the actual assembly hall where people would go and play games, play cards, hang out, sip wine, whatever. Right next to that is a little pagoda-like structure that was built originally in the 19th century. What's there now is a recreation of that original pagoda. That's wood, and of course wood decays in the winter, so they have to replace that. Underneath the pagoda is the Glen Alpine Spring. If you really like mineral water, really like mineral water, try it. It won't kill you, it doesn't have amoebas, doesn't have giardia, usually, unless there's a lot of flooding going on, then I wouldn't. But when it's bubbling out, it's safe to drink, and it tastes horrible. But there was a spring there, and that's the original reason that Nathan Gilmore, who founded the resort, after trying various other businesses in the area, that's the reason that it happened there, because there's a spring, it's beautiful, it's a little bit removed from Lake Tahoe. So, but if you ever go back there, if you've been at Fallen Leaf Lake, which is just on the west side of Lake Tahoe, a little bit north of South Lake Tahoe, it's a beautiful area. And you have some beautiful mountains right around it. Most of which, this whole giant run of which, was Nathan Gilmore's originally. Nathan Gilmore worked with men like John Muir and others, and Louis Agassiz. Not just worked, but at first met and discussed and wondered over the possibility of preserving that area, some of that area for posterity because it's absolutely gorgeous. And please keep in mind too, the other thing that's happening in the late 19th century in the Tahoe Basin. Down here, a little bit south of here and a little bit east of here, you have Virginia City. And Virginia City is a massive mine that required enormous quantities of timber, both for the structure of the mine. There's an innovative structure inside the mine that supports everything, basically 19th century German engineering, but wood-based. You had the production facilities where they would take the ore, crush the ore, and process it into gold and silver, primarily silver, of course. All of that required energy. And where did that energy and material, where did that come from? It came from the forests around here, much of which was the forest around Lake Tahoe. The forest was decimated. Absolutely. So a lot of the Tahoe area was undergoing deforestation, was an industrial backland for the mines and for the railroads and everything else that was happening in the development, the economic development of the region. So you have Glen Alpine Springs back there a little bit removed from that deforestation going on, and a nice place for people to go, right? And so as this is going on, you have these figures like John Muir who go back there and stay there, who are really interested in preserving it. Eventually, part of Gilmore's land becomes park. And that's why today it's park, because he gifted it over to the people of the United States so it could be a park. But if you walk around there and look at a USGS map and learn the names of some of those features, some of them are actually related to his business model. Before he started the resort, it's like, I just acquired this land. It became part of the United States not too long ago, and I've moved here and I've acquired the property. What can I do with it, right? Well, there's some nice grass here. I can run sheep, and he ran Angora sheep, and hence Angora Ridge is on USGS maps. Everybody knows a feature right there on just to the south of Glen Alpine Springs is Angora Ridge, and of course then you have Mount Talek there as well too. And if you go up there, there's actually a little lake on your hike up to the mountain peak, right? And that lake is an artificial lake that has a dam. He built the dam for his sheep and goats and whatever else you run around there. Eventually that became a place to take people at the resort on nice picnics. They would get dressed up in their wool hiking gear, women in skirts, men in trousers with a vest, and somebody would carry up the nice basket with the china and the great lunch, and they would have a lunch up there and maybe climb the peak and come back down. So a wonderful place. And that continues there until after World War II, where we change our model of recreation. Americans are not anymore taking the train to go to a place like Glen Alpine Springs. We want faster holidays, and we are all acquiring, especially after World War II, in massive numbers, cars, and we would just don't want to drive out. So a new model develops, and that's a totally different subject that I don't actually know very much about. I just know that it impacts it at this time, but it would be a fascinating study, and I'm sure there are great studies on it. And that is the rise of the motel, the motor hotel, and people just motoring out someplace, staying in the motel, and there you are. All right, that actually becomes the death knell of Glen Alpine Springs as a resort. The business model is no longer sustainable, and the whole place falls into disrepair until Robert Fritchie, who bought it, becomes the owner, and he began restoring some of the buildings. He bought it just to live there, and he lived in what is now the dining hall, or what was the dining hall, and some of the giant granite stones that are part of it, he actually had to do some reconstruction, and he single-handedly would haul these giant 120-pound boulders up and put them back in place and stuff. So, and at that time he didn't know what he was doing. He did know what he was doing, but he wasn't trained, preservation-focused architectural reconstruction. It's like, I want to fix this place up so it becomes my place. Slowly he realized what he had, and later on a very close friend of his also helped develop an understanding of what it was all about. It began the research into the history, and they determined that it would be, unconscionable not to actually bring it back into the public domain and help preserve it. And so they began more and more working on it to preserve the facility. A memorandum of understanding was established with the Forest Service that on his passing it would become property of the people of the United States. part of Forest Service lands and then be managed. And so for some years, and I haven't been up there in the last few summers because I've been doing other things and haven't had a chance to go up there, but for some years rangers would be there for some or all of the summer to help with the interpretive center that they worked to set up, that the Glen Alpine Springs organization worked to set up. And they used to do some really fun things up there when they were trying to raise money for some of the preservation efforts they undertook. One of which was to have a really magnificent in-costume 1920s style dinner, right? People would come up and pay a certain amount per plate as a donation, and they brought up some celebrity chefs from the Bay Area, cooked in that kitchen, which is a marvelous place to cook, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And then just, and then those were great fundraisers. I unfortunately learned about Glen Alpine Springs and became involved to some extent with Glen Alpine Springs after the period of time of those dinners, which was unfortunate because I didn't get to experience one in full bloom. My involvement with Glen Alpine Springs was actually as an educator, and before and actually in parallel with teaching at university, I was a Montessori teacher as well too, and worked with adolescents. And in fact, I was kind of handed a program, and wasn't something I expected to be doing. I was not handed a program, I was handed the opportunity to create a program. There was no program. In fact, when I started, there was one manila folder with about 5 pieces of paper in it. Like, great, okay, so now I'm in charge of a Montessori program, and we better figure out this summer what we're going to be doing in the fall. And there was myself and another teacher were involved in doing that, and we had in that first class, if I recall correctly, maybe about 16 young people, 7th and 8th graders. And we could spend hours talking about what it means to say that you're creating a Montessori program, but in general it's much more inquiry-based learning. It's about getting outside of the classroom, dissolving the classroom walls. It's about working with your hands as well as your mind, so we like to say head and hands as Montessori educators. We like to talk about pedagogy of place, where you take your students someplace. It could be on a campus or it could be off campus, where the education happens there. So they're not stuck at a desk reading about something, they're learning by doing. It was also a tradition of the particular school I was teaching at to take students out, it's a Montessori thing again, on excursions. Sometimes at that level they're called odysseys. So one of the things we had to face that summer is, where do we go on an odyssey? I had totally by accident been hiking back up, and I saw Glen Alpine Springs, didn't know anything about its history. There was a sign that the organization had put up, and I read the sign. It's like, this is really cool. Man, this could be a really cool opportunity for young people to come and experience the past and participate somehow in the preservation of the past. And also I was thinking of STEM elements too, and you're there in this glacial valley, so how much fun is that to stand on a moraine and learn about glacial features and do all the other cool things that you can also do out in the countryside. And it's actually a really cool area in the Tahoe area, because up on the highest level of topography right around it is seafloor. It's not actually granite, it's limestone, and it's seafloor, so you can even talk about the longer term history of the Earth and how a seafloor was lifted up by this granite batholith now to be a high point to overlook the entire Tahoe Basin from. So how cool is that? So there was an email, and I just emailed, hey, I'd like to bring 14 young people to stay a week at Glen Alpine Springs, and can we work this out? And we would be happy to help out in any way. And I got, to my surprise, an email back from Robert Fritchie that said, sure, all right, let's do it, right. The place needs a lot of maintenance, so we struck a deal. We could stay there, we could use the Bernard Maybeck kitchen, which has this magnificent wood-burning, hotel-sized wooden stove. Beautiful. Unfortunately, it was always too dry to use. I guess if we had gone in winter, but we went there at the end of summer, we perhaps would have been able to fire it up. But also a restaurant gas stove, because you need something to cook in the kitchen, right? But beautiful, pretty much original kitchen. We could use, some of the equipment we were using actually was the original equipment. There's an old refrigerator inside there, which no longer works. We just use it for storage to keep food away from the mice. But it's the original refrigerator that replaced an icebox. inside the kitchen. So very cool. And we use the dining hall as our center of operations and dormitory. There's also a cabin, the caretaker's cabin, also fireproof architecture in beautiful shape, and we were allowed to use that facility as well too. And there were lots of interesting experiences. Anybody listening to this or watching this who knows something about water in the Tahoe Basin, you'll know that sewage is an issue, right? Glen Alpine Springs is not connected to any kind of sewer line. There was a septic system designed, but no longer exists really. So everything, any kind of human waste, for instance, has to be handled with burner toilets. So that was an adventure, just teaching kids, there's no flush here, right? Okay, they put in a little piece of paper in there, and you do your thing, and you press the thing, and then it's going to get turned into ash. And I could go on ages, the reaction of young people to the like, but they adapted pretty quickly. So we used the facility and did all kinds of wonderful STEM and history stuff there. And the bargain was that we helped take care of the facility, which was wonderful because it gave me an opportunity as an educator to teach young people how you work to preserve older structures. You can't just use anything. Right? So on the wooden cabins, the material that was used when Mabeck designed them was linseed oil on the outside. So we put linseed oil. They're supposed to be coated every year. A lot of the industrial window sashes and the doors, which were also fireproof, were metal doors. Green enamel paint. It was very funny having some young people used to working with water-soluble paints. You look at them in the eye and you say, okay, this will not come off with water, right? Do not get it on yourself. Do not get it on your hair. Be super careful, right? And then to have some student come back and with green enamel paint in the hair, it's like, well, it's not going to come out. That was fun, actually. Everybody worked safely with it because everybody got lessons and had gloves and goggles on and stuff. What else did we do? We did some just cutting back of overgrowth too. When Glen Alpines was first founded as a resort, if you look at the historic pictures, you see a tree here and a tree there and a tree over here, and that's the natural vegetation due to the natural fire regime that existed in the area. And of course, in other parts, that low density set of trees was mowed down completely. Today, if you go to Glen Alpine Springs, it's a veritable dense forest, right? Which is another issue entirely. But because of that growth, things have to be cut back. So we also did a little bit of gardening there as well too. Great experience. We kept doing that for a number of years. One particular year that was kind of fun, we had an opportunity to actually involve the students in doing a topographic map of Glen Alpine Springs. So there's this, I have great pictures of Montessori students taking points with a total station, learning how to use the total station and stadial rod and prism. The total station uses a laser to measure distances, right? So even though they weren't yet at the point where they would be learning trigonometry in school, here was a perfect example of what trigonometry was used for. So they're perfectly primed not to walk into math class as a high school student and go, why am I learning trigonometry? Because they already knew where trigonometry was being used in real life. So that was kind of fun. They also got to do some algebra stuff, which they could do with that too and plot things out. So it was a real pleasure to be able to work there. My price for working there was I got drafted onto the board. And then I served for a couple of years on the board as well too until I moved on to other things. And so that's my involvement in it. And it is a wonderful place to educate. It's informally as a museum. That was in fact Robert's dream, that it be turned into a museum. There's an old barn that's part of the original architecture built by Gilmore. It's still there, and it would be a phenomenal interpretive center if ever this were to happen.
So you end up on the board, and is that how you became involved with the formal historic preservation effort? Because Glen Alpine Springs is now on the National Historic Register and has just achieved landmark status. Or is that still?
The landmark status, to my understanding, is still in process. And yes, so I was involved in that, and also trying to imagine how to create a sustainable economic model for Glen Alpine Springs, which is a bit of an issue there are many ways. If you think of the typical house museum, and Glen Alpine Springs essentially is a house museum, only it's a resort rather than a private house. And there are plenty of examples right around in the Reno area that some of the UNR students go to and even do internships at. And it's a precarious thing to be a house museum. There are tens of thousands in the United States at this point. Who knows how many there are around the world. Most of them have small budgets. Most of them can't afford to hire a lot of people to work there because of the budgetary issues. Most of them have to do other things to maintain their yearly operating budgets. One of which might be, for instance, to hold weddings. And there are a couple of examples just down here of places that do that. That isn't possible at Glen Alpine Springs. And so coming up with a business model was an issue that we wrestled with a lot when I was on the board. The registry status and then National Register status and then the landmark application process was actually in process, and there is a firm in San Francisco that did the landmark application, largely did the landmark application, and that was simply in process at that point. And it's kind of here's our application and we'll see what happens. I think there needs at this point to be follow-up, and there may well be some follow-up, and I can't speak to that because I haven't been active on the board for some time now. But I'm curious myself where that is going and what they've achieved.
So can you talk a little bit about historic preservation? There are a number of criteria, and Glen Alpine Springs qualified under several of the criteria, correct?
Sure. I mean, we have this wonderful collection of buildings, both pre-Bernard Maybeck and also Maybeck. They're pristine examples of architecture, so they're not heavily modified. The Bernard Maybeck buildings are what they are. They're essentially the buildings that Maybeck designed, and even the buildings that Maybeck furnished down to the glassware. If you go into the kitchen, the original hotel plates and stemware, it's all in there still. The furniture inside the dining room is Bernard Maybeck's furniture that he designed and had built for the resort. So it's amazing, right? So it's this intact, unaltered example of something that is both special, very special, and unique, and associated with a figure in American history, in American architectural history, who is regarded as centrally important to the story of American architecture and is centrally involved with not as a primary architect, but as certainly an influence, with the entire rustic architecture movement that we see at national parks. Right? There's a strong connection between the rustic movement and all the rustic architecture and what Maybeck and other colleagues were doing in the Bay Area. So these structures fit right into that story, landmark. The other thing about it is the connections with the development of the national parks and John Muir's presence and others who were there as well too, which is an element of the history of Glen Alpine Springs that we don't really understand yet as well as we might. There may be more historical records, primary documents, letters, who knows, that might help elucidate that story as well too. So, but that's an important element of the story as well too. That certainly is maybe an adjunct to the story of Yosemite, but it nonetheless is very important as part of this larger story about parks in the West. So another reason for it to perhaps be considered as something that we should deem, if not on the register, a landmark as well. But it's the history, the overall history, the importance as an example of the early recreation industry in the Tahoe area, and its importance as a living example of Maybeck's architectural design that probably qualifies it for landmark status. Again, it's a proposal and not a done deal yet. But those are elements that definitely do. Everything down to the windows is original, and Robert Fritchie was very careful to maintain the originality of the windows. So if you know anything about windows in the 1920s, window glass panes, the technology hadn't yet been really perfected, so there's a lot of imperfection on the surface and windows look wavy. There are imperfections in the window. And anytime one of those windows, and the panes are about yay big, is broken, and things break, right, through time. That's just normal. They were always and always are replaced with the original style of glass. And there are sources for buying historically appropriate preservation glass. Much more expensive than going to Home Depot, unfortunately. And so the buildings have been maintained in a way that they reflect their originality. So that also is a criteria that's really important. And when you think about the buildings on UNR's campus that are also on the register, and there was an application to put multiple buildings, the earliest buildings on campus, Lincoln Hall, Morrill Hall, and others around the first quad. Same thing, right? The architecture is fairly well preserved, particularly on the outside, but even on the inside too.
So Glen Alpine Springs, because it's so beautifully preserved, gives us some interesting insight. You mentioned, you touched on this briefly, I'd like you to go a little deeper. The emergence of the recreation industry, but also the rise of the leisure class. Prior to industrialization, we didn't have time to go spend 2 weeks or a month at some resort.
Absolutely. We didn't, right? Some people always had time for leisure, right?
But the
masses of the population certainly did not have time. And because there were so few who might engage in something that was recreative and remove them from their normal pace and place of life, there's certainly not an industry that develops. But that said, anybody who's read Chaucer and then thought about pilgrimage, that's not what we think about recreation as recreation, right? Going on a pilgrimage to Rome, or going on a pilgrimage to Compostela, or any of the other pilgrimages people undertake. India has a fabulous tradition that goes back in the medieval period and even earlier in India of pilgrimages as well too. I don't know if you want to consider a pilgrimage recreation, but it certainly takes people out of their normal life. There's certainly an infrastructure, actually probably one of the best examples of that, of pilgrimage, and leaving your normal life and staying places, hostels, hotels, whatever, right? And having to find transportation or having a path or road that people traditionally walk, plus protection. Right? You don't want to undertake a journey if you think that 15 miles into your journey you're going to be dead at some thieves' knife, would be the Hajj in the Islamic tradition, right? Going to Mecca. And if you read earlier descriptions from the centuries following Muhammad's life of people undertaking the Hajj as it develops, these are not short-term things. You're leaving home, you're gone for maybe a year and coming back. And any able-bodied Muslim is highly recommended to undertake this journey. So a lot of people are doing this. They're coming from West Africa through the desert, right, on camel caravans. They're coming across North Africa. Eventually they're coming from as far as Indonesia, all before modern air travel, all before really safe maritime traffic, right? If you had to cross the Indian Ocean on a dhow, those get swamped and they sink in high numbers historically. There was some risk in these journeys. And as you're traveling, you have to have places to stay and people to feed you and mechanisms to make that happen. So somebody has to pay for that food or provide that food, right? How does all that happen, right? So in a certain sense, these industries have existed, but they've existed under other guise and for other purposes. So what changes is, yes, we have suddenly, with industrialization in particular, but especially with the second industrial revolution, right, where we have railroads and everything and things are really developing here, then you begin to see people undertaking trips for other reasons, right? There's another idea of going away. What is the purpose of going away, right? We're not going on a pilgrimage someplace. We're just going someplace and we're going to chill out. I'm not going to see patients for a month. I'm going to take my family. They're not in school, right? We're going to alter our life. We're going to sort of close up our house in the city and live in a tent for a month, right? And there's all kinds of other stuff that goes with this, the whole notions of rusticating and the value of doing that, right? The whole idea of landscape and the importance of returning, if you will, to nature as American culture develops, right? The whole reason for the national parks, all of that is all tied together, right? And certainly industrialization, the existence of the railroad, all of that makes it possible, right? The changes in risk on the landscape as well, too. You have to feel safe, right? To leave your house in San Francisco and take a train up into the mountains and then go into the backcountry and camp there, right? You're not going to take your children there unless you think and feel it's safe. So there are lots of factors that are involved in this transformation, but it's a very definite transformation in the purposes of undertaking a leaving of your normal life. That absolutely is a change and a radical change.
John Muir said, "The mountains are calling and I must go."
Yeah, absolutely.
And that really, the constant onslaught of urban life, the idea that we needed a retreat from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so Glen Alpine Springs really filled a need, as it were. Are there any other similar resorts that have survived at all into the 21st century in the Tahoe region?
So people used to go, and I don't know enough about the history of Camp Richardson to answer in detail about what happened there, but yes, I mean, Camp Richardson comes out, people are also going there. And some people are coming into Glen Alpine Springs, but Glen Alpine Springs really is the only place that survives and that you can point to and say, here are some of the original buildings, here's what was built later on, here's the furniture that people dined on. It's one of the few places, if not the only place in the Tahoe area right now. I don't think anything else survives.
So that singular, unique quality of Glen Alpine Springs, did that factor in significantly into its being placed on the National Historic Register?
Absolutely, right? It is an example of that early recreational culture, and it's not just one building, but it's a complex of buildings. It's a whole place that serves as an example and points to what people were doing for leisure in the 19th century, those that could afford to do that.
It's not, for example, with churches. We've got a lot of those.
Sure.
We've got a lot of, this is unique.
It is unique, right.
And
yet some churches are also on the register.
Yeah,
for good reason.
For good reason, absolutely. But we have this snapshot of history.
Absolutely.
That's so rare and such a fine. So how long, if you can just, because I think a lot of people don't understand the process of submitting a nomination to the Historic Register and how detailed and involved it is and the research that you have to do to document.
Yeah,
this.
so for that, you really do need it's a form, essentially, right? But we're talking about 20 pages, 30 pages, 40 pages of a form detailing the structures, explaining why they should put on the register, pointing out the elements of the structures that are original. If a building has been remade 90%, that's unlikely to go onto the register, right? So you're creating an architectural historical argument as to why this building should be protected because it is reflective of a particular style or something else related in time, right? But it needs to be fairly intact, and those are detailed proposals. Right? Generally, there's sort of a summary explanation of why it's important, and then building by building by building, here's why this building is relatively or nearly or completely pristine, and that's grounds then for putting on the register, because the purpose of the register is to acknowledge and help protect these structures for future generations.
So as you've gone through this process, what have you learned? And is there anything?
What have I learned?
Is there anything that you do differently?
Oh, which process?
With the informal historic preservation and then the formal process of nomination to the National Register. I'm sure you learned a lot along the way, and I'd like to hear about that.
Well, so yes, I have, and it's from in my particular time when I was involved in that. So things I would do differently. At the time, there were issues of you're not just on a board, right? You have other things going on in your life and other professional obligations. So in a perfect world, we should have all had more time to attend to what needed to be attended to. I'm not sure that could have played out differently. A lot of people do not know about the site. So one of the things that I think that we were always, and that perhaps continually remiss, is somehow getting out the word in a better way. Getting more people interested, getting more people involved. That's all, was always an issue. Finding other people to serve on the board, or people walking through, you find it, there's a ranger there in the summer, this is great, wonderful. You see the sign, you check out the website. So people were aware of it, but there needed to be more of that. And that came and went. There were some individuals that lived relatively nearby that at one point were involved in writing out letters and all the small stuff that you do if you're trying to create a small nonprofit where you're receiving small donations and you're sending out thank yous. That had to be made larger, and that was something that was very difficult for us to do. So if we could have somehow found some additional hands on deck to help us with that, that would have been a phenomenal thing. I think that's one of the continuing issues with the site. And as you pointed out, the web page has disappeared, and there's a little bit of a Facebook page, but not really that much. And much of its story that is not really being told on that, and can't be told there either the way it should be. So those are things that it would be nice. There were other things that it would have been nice to continue to bring young people there. That became difficult to do in part because the size grew and sanitation was an issue, right? With a small class, you could use the burner toilets. Once we reached 20, we realized that with the cycle required on those toilets, there's a certain amount of time where it actually ashes the human waste. If you have too many people, that cycle can't complete because there's the next person in line on the next person in line to use a facility. That was an issue. So we brought in porta potties, but that wasn't such a great solution either. We experimented with compostable or sort of composting toilet units. But it was those kind of logistic issues were a problem. The dream was always to have a wilderness toilet be put in by the Forest Service, the kind that you can find at the parking lot, and that would solve part of that issue. That was never solved. And it would have been nice for that to be solved. Had that been solved, then we could have continued to involve students at the site in larger numbers, and that would have had a beautiful cascade effect on, because the parents thought it was great, and they would come up and on some years we brought parents on the last day. And it's like, wow, this is a wonderful place, we didn't know about it. I mean, that's gold because they start talking about it in the community, more people become aware of it, and then pretty soon you have other people involved, or you have people willing to finance upgrades, or somebody might come along and say, hey, this is a wonderful idea to turn this barn into a museum. I'd like to help donate to a capital campaign for that, right? All that becomes possible. So that was an Achilles heel, but that wasn't something that the preservation organization could solve. That was actually something that had to be solved via the Forest Service, right? Which meant the Forest Service spending money. And I'm not sure if there are any conversations going on about that right now in the current, in the last few years, and certainly probably nothing at all in the current climate that we have. So in the future, that's on top on the to-do list. If you want to have people there, if you want to use those facilities, if there were to be a more permanent interpretive center through much of the year, and it's becoming more possible to do it through the winter as well too, as our climate changes and the snowpack levels change, and that would be wonderful. But that's one of those very real elements of running a small little museum, an interpretive center that have to be solved, and have to be solved in a regionally and ecologically appropriate way. So those are things that would have been nice had we been able to help solve during my tenure and my involvement in the place. And one of the reasons I keep talking about it is I keep hoping that other people like you will get excited and talk about it and share it with other people and get them excited, and maybe at that point it'll again move forward as well, because that's what it needs, and it more than deserves to be on travel guides, well known and well visited. But if it's going to be well visited, it also has to be cared for in a way that it's there for the next generation and the next generation. Yeah. So what the first part? What was the question again? I'm sorry. I started talking on that. I'm like, what do I with?
I asked about what you learned, both
right
in the
and
formal process and then in the formal process of his nomination to the his.
Yeah, I wish I actually at that point when I was involved with it, I could have learned more about the formal process, because a lot of that was handled by the architectural firm, and that was what they do, or is what they do in San Francisco, and so I missed out on some of that. I have the products, right, and I can show them to you in my office, and they're good. There were some things if that would be something, if I could go back in a time machine and say, hey guys, this part of your application really, we need to reword this. I mean, there's small stuff like that. And so I guess I learned from that no application is perfect, and in hindsight there are always things that one might wish to change. And were there to be another opportunity if the landmark status, it hasn't gone through, if there were an opportunity to bring it up again, those would be certainly things to look at, right? Learning from the previous process, and okay, what did we miss on this? What can we improve on this? Because it certainly should have that status.
So technology has just come at a breakneck pace in the last decade. I think of Steve Jobs and his seminal talk when he launched the iPhone, and he talked about the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. And is there that opportunity there with Glen Alpine Springs to utilize technology to reach people?
Absolutely. And I'm chuckling because I've been on the planet for a while, and so, people have been saying what Jobs said long before Jobs said it and the iPhone came along. Back in the day when the internet was restricted to some thousands of people, right? Back in the day when something like the internet existed more locally. The Well is a famous example, which was an online community in the Bay Area in the 80s. I remember a coworker I had as a recent Berkeley graduate before I went off to graduate school, had a Radio Shack color computer which he ran a bulletin board off of with all 16K of memory. So technology has allowed people to interact for a long time, and people have been talking about, as our digital technologies have been developing, about these increasing opportunities, right? So Jobs stated the obvious, yes, right? And with the internet as it came online for most people in the late 90s, was a Gopher user. That was before the World Wide Web, right? It was another internet protocol, FTP, all those things, right? Then we were like, no, we should probably go to secure FTP, right? And then, what's this great thing from CERN and the Mosaic browser? This is cool, right? I actually, I set up an assignment once in one class of mine. It was a college archaeology class, where the students actually had to access it was an series of archaeological problems, right? But it was the first time that I had ever seen it done on the internet, and I set up a website and we put the problems on there. Some of it was interactive. It was like Web 0.2 at the time, right? So I've seen these possibilities grow, and it was really kind of interesting. Some of the students had never used a web browser before. The library had web browsers for about 1.5 years, and they had moved their catalog to the web basis of the web. So theoretically they were supposed to be familiar with it, right? Not all of them were. That says something about about where they were spending their time, not on the library. But seeing them and introducing young people to this new technology was kind of fun, right? Because they didn't know what was coming their way. They had no clue, right? And this is, at the time where some people were saying, oh no, this World Web thing is going to be, it's like CB, it's going to it's like a flash of gunpowder and a camera, right? The 19th century. Oh no, they didn't see what was coming their way. So Jobs is absolutely right. This tsunami of change has come our way, right? This tsunami of new kinds of interconnections. And, those of us who are old enough to remember newsletters coming out from little organizations like Glen Alpine Springs. This is what we did last spring, right? And a restricted mailing list, right? And those mailing lists were gold. Mailing lists are still gold, but they're digital, they're email, and they reach millions of people. And, this incredible ability to reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, of millions of people through platforms like Facebook, right? Through liking and connecting up with organizations, and you see a friend did it and said something about it. Next thing you're checking it out, and you're like, oh, I'm going to follow that, right? Totally and absolutely transformative. And yet, lots of little organizations, house museums, small museums, other organizations, cultural organizations still have, a small set of people. So yes, it's promising, but it doesn't automatically translate to it all happens automatically, right? As we all know, once we had the internet, once we had browsers, once we worked out the kinks and moved past Web 0.1, right, onto something a little bit more secure, right? People experimented with e-commerce. Then it was like, oh, and then somebody came along and said, you know what? This trying to classify sites on like a virtual library, like we used to do, right? You click on the history thing and there'd be some long list of history sites, right? Companies like Google and others came along, created search algorithms, and now the game was, how do I get onto that first page? Out of at first hundreds and then thousands and now millions of pages, right? So yes and no. It is transformative, obviously. A cousin of mine, her husband had a sort of a lifelong dream as a technology guy, and started a little startup to create a specialized browser that would allow people to do virtual tours in places or have games, right? And with clues as you stood on someplace, and the phone would pick it up by GPS that you would solve the problem. There you were on the street corner someplace, and now here's the next clue, right? And so they had a great fun with that. And those kind of platforms are going to be wonderful, because that's the kind of thing then that leads to the possibility to create some kind of digital experience, an app experience at a place like Glen Alpine Springs. And then, of course, there's augmented reality, which is coming into its own now as we speak, right? And will continue to become much more important in time, especially if battery life improves on cell phones. That's an issue. And I've seen early examples of augmented reality that are quite really cool. One example that comes to mind was an experiment by some archaeologists interested in phenomenological archaeology, which is, recreating or trying to sort of get back to what the experience of a place was, right? And their goal was to, they were Romanists, and they were from the UK, and they wanted you to be able to stand on a hill where Hadrian's Wall had extended along and see it in its full glory in your phone or your iPad or your Windows tablet or whatever, right? And just hold it up and whoa, there's the wall, right? Or the goggles too, right? So that's all coming down the pike. Those are all possibilities. Imagine for a little place like Glen Alpine Springs. Not only can you have the physical objects, because